In 1957, the world's first commercial nuclear power plant began operation in Shippingport, Pennsylvania. And with this start, nuclear power became a viable energy alternative. In 1992, nuclear power is America's second largest source of electric power, after coal. The nation's 111 nuclear power plants produce more than 20% of all the electricity consumed in the United States. The use of nuclear power to generate electricity has several benefits, including an environmentally clean technology and decreased dependence on foreign oil. Coal, oil, gas, and nuclear power plants all operate on the same principle. Water is heated into steam, and steam drives a generator that produces electricity. The only difference between nuclear plants and fossil fuel plants is the heat source used to turn the water into steam. The source of heat in a fossil fuel plant comes from directly igniting the fuel as it passes into the boiler. The heat from the burning fuel changes water into steam. The source of heat in a nuclear power plant comes from a nuclear reaction called fission that takes place within tiny uranium pellets which are encased in the fuel rods. During the fission reaction, a free neutron strikes the nucleus of an unstable uranium atom and causes it to split apart, creating two new elements and releasing 2 or 3 neutrons, which in turn collide with more uranium atoms. The fission chain reaction takes place entirely within a closed loop and produces enough heat to turn water in a second closed loop into steam. The steam drives a turbine which is connected to a generator that produces electricity. Then, cool water from a third closed loop condenses the steam back into water, and the cycle continues. Although the spent fuel from a nuclear reactor becomes less hazardous over time, some of the fission products remain radioactive for thousands of years. When removed from the reactor, the fuel is in the same solid form it was when it went into the reactor. But it now contains radioactive byproducts and must be carefully handled. The spent fuel is stored at the nuclear power plants in steel-lined concrete pools filled with water. The water cools the spent fuel and acts as a shield to protect workers from radiation. Some plants now store the spent fuel above ground in large, dry storage containers made of steel and concrete that protect workers and the environment. But storage of spent fuel at the sites was never intended to be permanent. In 1982, Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. This act created a program to develop a system to include permanent disposal of the nation's spent fuel and other high-level nuclear wastes deep underground in a geologic repository. To carry out the program, the act created an office within the U.S. Department of Energy, the Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management, to develop and operate the waste management system. Several areas in the United States were identified as potential sites for the repository. But in 1987, Congress directed the Department of Energy to study only one site, Yucca Mountain in Nevada, as a possible location for the repository. The Department of Energy is now performing site characterization studies to determine if Yucca Mountain is suitable to host a repository. Before any site is approved, the government must provide reasonable assurance that the public health and safety will be protected. The plan in this country and in most countries around the world that generate electricity from nuclear power is to dispose of the spent fuel deep underground in rock formations. There it will remain safely isolated from people and the environment for the thousands of years it remains hazardous. The design for the planned repository in the United States is based on the concept of defense in depth. This concept has many barriers, both natural and engineered, to permanently isolate the spent fuel and high-level wastes from the accessible environment. Now, the first barrier would be the waste package to be buried at the site. The spent fuel assemblies would be encased in a disposal container constructed of corrosion-resistant materials. The disposal container would then be transported down a ramp with a gradual slope to the second barrier, at least 1,000 feet below the ground. The second barrier would consist of engineered barriers. The proposed repository in the United States would call for disposal in boreholes drilled in the floor of a massive series of tunnels or chambers carved out of the host rock. When the holes are filled, the tunnels will be backfilled with crushed rock or concrete. And finally, there is a third barrier, the host rock itself. At Yucca Mountain, the host rock is volcanic tuff, geologically formed millions of years ago. The United States isn't alone in this approach to the safe disposal of nuclear waste. Many repository designs around the world also call for disposal in boreholes carved out of the host rock deep beneath the ground. In the United States, disposal of spent fuel has been demonstrated in a similar geologic facility that was carved deep underground in a rock formation. During a demonstration conducted from 1979 to 1982, the Climax test facility was constructed in granite approximately 1,400 feet below the surface at the Nevada test site. There were 17 boreholes carved in the floor of the facility. Canisters of spent fuel were placed in 11 of the boreholes, and heaters were placed in the other 6 holes for studies related to thermal activity. The results of the Climax demonstration are very valuable to scientists as they study Yucca Mountain as a possible site for a repository. But remember, Yucca Mountain cannot be selected as the site for the repository until DOE completes extensive studies at that site. These studies will take about 10 years. If DOE finds that Yucca Mountain is not suitable, then Congress may direct the department to study other sites. If DOE finds Yucca Mountain is suitable, and if the President and the U.S. Congress agree, permanent disposal of spent fuel and high-level wastes could begin around the year 2010. In the meantime, the Department of Energy must build a facility for the temporary storage of spent nuclear fuel. Now, this Monitored Retrievable Storage Facility, or MRS, is an important part of the Nuclear Waste Management Program. An MRS facility would receive the spent fuel from the nuclear power plants and temporarily store it until permanent disposal is available. The MRS would be closely regulated and supervised. No site for an MRS has been identified, but the technology planned for the MRS is not new. Above-ground storage techniques are already in use at several nuclear power plants, including Surry in Virginia, Oconee and H.B. Robinson in South Carolina, and other plants around the world, including Pickering in Canada. At Surry and Pickering, the spent fuel is stored vertically in huge steel casks on a concrete platform. At Oconee and Robinson, the spent fuel is stored horizontally in canisters inserted into massive steel and concrete bunkers. On October 17, 1991, the Mescalero Apache tribe of New Mexico was awarded the first grant to study the feasibility of operating an above-ground, monitored retrievable storage facility. Since then, several other Indian tribes and local governments have applied for and received feasibility study grants. And one of the biggest concerns about nuclear waste storage and disposal is the safe transportation of the spent nuclear fuel from the nuclear power plants. One of the most important factors in transportation safety is the cask used to ship the spent fuel. Transport casks are designed to withstand the most severe accidents. For Nuclear Regulatory Commission certification, the casks must survive the following tests in sequence. First, the cask must be able to survive a drop onto an unyielding surface from 30 feet. Then it must be able to survive a 40-inch drop onto a steel shaft. It must survive exposure to fire at 1,475 degrees for 30 minutes. And finally, after it has passed all those tests, the cask must survive submersion in water for 8 hours. Now, the safety record for shipments of nuclear waste over the past 40 years is excellent, in large part due to these types of stringent requirements. While accidents have occurred, there has never been a death, injury, or environmental damage due to a release of the radioactivity of the cargo. Still, some people are concerned about the transportation, storage, and disposal of spent nuclear fuel and high-level nuclear waste. That's why it's important to involve the public in the management of the nation's nuclear waste. All affected and interested parties deserve answers to their questions and the opportunity to participate in the decision-making process before the waste is shipped, stored, or disposed of in a repository. But decisions need to be made now, as spent nuclear fuel accumulates at nuclear power plants, some with operating licenses that will expire in the near future. Permanent disposal of this spent fuel and other nuclear wastes is imperative now and for thousands of years to come. That's why Congress directed the U.S. Department of Energy to develop a waste management system that includes the safe transportation, storage, and disposal of the nation's nuclear wastes. These jobs must be done now, and they must be done in a way that fully protects the workers, the public, and the environment.